Good morning, here we are. Well, morning, afternoon, 12 o'clock. I'm never quite sure what you say that is. Anyway, here we are. I've got my cup of tea. Hope you've got your cup of tea and your sandwich or whatever it is you do in your lunch break. Ready for Facebook Live. Have we got anybody on the logged in yet, Vicky?
Not yet. No, not yet.
Not yet. Shall I wait a minute then? Okay, well, we're just going to go ahead. So, today I'm going to be talking about the science that underpins reflexology. I don't want you to think that this is going to give you you press this button, it's a magic button, and it does this, this, and this in the body, and that's the change you get in any individual. This is not going to be about that sort of thing. This is very much about looking at what we have, and also what there is out there that has some relevancy to reflexology, and the bigger picture about what it is we do. We don't press magic buttons. We treat individuals, and within treating individuals, we have to be aware of the things that those individuals might be going through, but also the things that the individual's bodies are doing. And I hope that at the end of this talk, you will have some awareness of this. Now, I gave this talk at the RAC meeting in Canada a couple of months back, and we realised that actually you need to know this as much as the Canadian reflexologist. So this is the first half of my talk. I have a second half, which is looking at the research that's been done on reflexology, and that whole talk is going to be videoed and put out as a free download, a free one of the would have been pay per view, but it's actually going to be free for you to be able to see. So you'll be able to see the whole talk at some point in the future. So this is the front end of it. So I'm talking about the science that underpins reflexology. I'm just going to have a quick cup of tea and put that down and pick up my thing to move the slides. And as you all know, I'm Tracey Smith, and that's my email address if you want to get in contact with me. Obviously, if you want to leave messages, questions, etc. on the Facebook page after this, because if you're not watching it live, obviously you won't be able to do it I won't be able to answer them in live time, then please feel free to do so, and I will take it forwards whenever I get a chance. So let's first of all think about reflexology. What is reflexology? Where does it come from? So obviously we have ancient theory. That ancient theory is potentially Chinese, it could be Egyptian, we don't really know. I think the links to Egypt are actually quite tenuous, but certainly in China it's been used for thousands of years, and we have points on the feet that are mapped to different parts of points of the feet, but not only the feet. We tend to use extremities, and those areas have been mapped to different parts of the body. So when I say extremities, I mean feet and hands, but also now ears has been for a while, but now face as well. And we have to recognise that those areas might have different underlying mechanisms to them. And of course we have a foot map. We have a foot map as seen there. That is the AoR foot map. It won't necessarily match the foot map that you trained to, because each training school or training organisation has a tendency to use their own. So Western reflexology, it may not have been linked to China. We don't really know, because at the end of the day, China was a bit closed down in the early 1900s. So we don't know whether William Fitzgerald found something or it came about completely separately. But William Fitzgerald, who was an ENT surgeon, so he was on the medical side of things, he started looking into this in the early 1900s, and he defined a theory where the body is split into 10 zones, and those zones run down the fingers, run down the feet, and straight into the whole of the body. He's obviously known as the father of reflexology. Now this is a picture out of his book, and I urge you to go and look at the book if you can find it. You can still buy it online. I got it about 3 years ago, and I will put up the details of where I got it from. It's an astonishingly frightening book, to be honest with you, because they use electrical probes to the top of the mouth, they use electrical stimuli all over the place, and but from it came the work that Eunice Ingham did, and Eunice Ingham was his colleague, apprentice, acolyte, whatever you want to call it, and she was either a physiotherapist or a chiropractor. It's not really clear, and I think that was because back in those days the definitions of what you did were much more fluid. And she used specific experimental methods to produce the first foot map. So she would have maybe 10 clients who all had thyroid problems. She'd poke about on their feet and she'd go, oh, and this is the place where your thyroid seems to feel different in your feet compared to people who don't have thyroid problems. So that's where I'm going to put the thyroid reflex. That was how the foot map came about. And obviously, as we know, the foot map was then copyrighted, and that is why there is a whole load of different foot maps, because you can't use a foot map that's copywritten unless you pay copyright costs. So everybody just went away and did their own foot maps. Hence the reason that there are these slight, although certainly there, variations within the foot maps. Now, these are wise words from Eunice Ingham, and we are going to use this as an Instagram post, I think. It's such a reasonable and underpinning description of reflexology, which is, if you're feeling out of kilter, don't know why or what about, let your feet reveal the answer, find the sore spot, rub it out. And that again is saying there are no magic buttons. What you are doing is you are feeling for the bit of the body, the bit of their body, of the individual sitting in front of you, the bit of their body that is showing you that it is out of balance. And that's from the book Stories the Feet Can Tell Through Reflexology, which was written in 1938. So although that may feel quite a long time ago, it's actually relatively recent in terms of complementary therapies. So our theory of reflexology is that by applying pressure to specific points of the feet, or the hands, or the ears, or the face, the extremities, and by releasing any areas of discomfort, so when you feel those areas that are out of balance, you rebalance them, you then allow the body to rebalance, and that naturally restores wellness and well-being. So that's a fairly rounded, I would hope that most of you would agree that that's what you consider the theory to be of reflexology to be. And that's kind of so far so fluffy, to be honest. It's very much a theory. There is very little research behind it. We're going to run through the 4 or 5 studies that there are out there at the moment. So we don't have precise knowledge of how it works. We can't answer those questions. Tell me, if I press this bit, what is it doing? So we have to look at the bigger picture. We have to look at other areas of science where they are going with their research, but also what we are doing in terms of when we press something on the feet, what might we be pressing? And there are other branches of science that might help, and I'm going to talk about some of those. So what do we do? I think that's a fairly reasonable start point. We apply pressure to specific points, and remember, this is reflexology originally was hands and feet only. There has been movements, developments, changes to put it into other areas such as ears and face, but originally it was only hands and feet. So it's plantar hands and feet doesn't make sense. That slide is wrong. So it was plantar feet and soles of the hands. And many reflexology points, you will have learnt this and how to do it properly, are activated by an on-off pressure or the caterpillar walk. So the caterpillar walk is very intrinsic to what we do as reflexologists. You will have all learnt it when you started learning reflexology. However, it's not the only technique we use to balance our reflex points. We also use a hold the surface and press. We use a hook and back up. Hook and back up is very specific for use it with the adrenal glands. I don't know if you can see this, what I'm doing, but adrenal glands, pituitary gland, we hook and back up. We use energy. We use light touch. We use linking, which is part of the energy work, which is where you put thumb and third finger and you link 2 different points together. In addition, and I think we really need to take this part a little bit more seriously, because we tend to think of it as oh, it's the nice bit on the side or on the end, we use effleurage movements. So effleurage movements is stroking, we stroke backs of feet, we stroke the lower legs, we stroke the hands, we stroke the arms, lots of effleurage movement. And if you are doing a shorter and lighter treatment, for example, someone who's been extremely unwell, someone who's been through cancer therapy, someone who's old or very young, you will probably be doing an awful lot more effleurage than you will be doing those specific caterpillar movements, or those hook and back up, or the more static, intense pressure work. So therefore you are doing more effleurage. And that is quite an important thing when you start to understand what effleurage might be doing. So how does reflexology help? Well, we kind of know this. We do it day in and day out, but how often do we actually list it? So I thought I'd list it for you. We rebalance, we de-stress, we probably help with pain, although it's problematic to claim that under the Advertising Standards Authority requirements. We probably help at an emotional level. It certainly feels good. I think you'll find that most of your clients feel better after they've finished their treatments. It's enjoyable. It enhances body awareness. How many times have you had a client come back into you and go, oh, do you know, I noticed something that I'd never noticed before? Or I started noticing I'm thirsty, which I never was before. They probably were. They just lost the ability to notice it and thereby do something with it. And of course, it helps with well-being. Well-being is the big thing we can claim under the Advertising Standards Authority. Well-being, you know, if we are purveyors of well-being, I'm very happy with that, and I hope you would be too. And there are probably other things we do as well, but I'm not going to get into them on this talk. But there's something to think about. What other things do you think we do? So going back to thinking about what research we have that is very specific to reflexology, we have to pin it down to the very, very few small studies that look at how reflexology might work. Not does it work, which is the greater proportion of the research that's done, but actually how it might work. So we start with this paper back in 1999 by Sudermeyer et al. And whenever you hear et al, it means that there were loads of other people involved and they're listed, but we don't say them every time. So this was done in Germany. The article is written and published in German, but we have got a copy and we have translated it into English. And it was looking at renal blood flow via colour Doppler sonography. So sonography is what's used to look at the baby in utero. Colour Doppler sonography is simply a different way of looking at it, and it uses colour to see change. So it was a randomised controlled trial. They compared reflexology to the kidney point to a control of eyes, ears and nose reflexes. So you wouldn't expect to have the same results coming through on the eyes, ears and nose reflexes as you would with the kidney reflex. It was 32 healthy volunteers, and they looked at it via colour Doppler scan of the arcuate artery. The arcuate artery is a specific artery that comes out of the kidney and it curves, hence the word arcuate. So the results of this was that they showed an immediate reduction in resistive index and an increase of renal blood flow during the application of reflexology. It was a very small change, and it did not continue once the reflexology came off the kidney point, but it didn't happen when they treated the eyes, ears and whatever the other area was. And this change in resistive index, that overall came out to show a reduction of resistive index, and that was highly significant. So when the person was applying the pressure to the kidney point, it came out as a change in resistive index in the kidney. And this was evidence for the hypothesis that foot reflexology exerts a transitory positive influence on kidney blood flow. So resistance, it reduced resistance, and resistance is the measure of difficulty of passing something through something. So you'll often hear resistance in terms of electric circuits, for example. In the body, It's to do with how much flow there is usually through something. With a higher resistance, there is less flow. With a lower resistance, there is more flow. So this is going back to our thoughts that we probably make a difference in terms of passing blood through the filtration system in the kidney. This was as I say, a very small study and a very long time ago study, and it's never been bettered or repeated. However, the same group, some of the same group, as you can see here, Moore, Egger and I think Herald were on the original paper, so this is of the same group but with different authors. And this was only published in German again, and again we've had it translated. And this one was looking at blood flow through the mesenteric artery, so looking at the effect of reflexology on the gut or the intestinal system. Mesentery is the intestinal system. And this was published in 2001, so 2 years later. They looked at 32 adults. They had a mixture of male and female. That was probably pointed out in the first one, but I missed it. They looked at the treatment group. Now this, because it's in Germany, they used foot reflexology zone. I can't remember what the M stands for, but it's something complex. So they used FRZM to intestinal zones, and then they used it to unrelated zones. And there was no statistical difference within any of the measurements between the two groups in the first instance. So they compared the two groups. There was no difference. Neither the patient nor the person doing the measurements knew whether they were in the treatment group or the unrelated zones group. And they measured the blood pressure in the mesenteric artery this time, so that artery going to the mesentery. And they found that in both groups, because they measured the heartbeat as well, they found both groups the heartbeat rate fell. So both were having relaxation during the reflexology treatment phase. But they also noticed, and this is the big information, that there was a statistical significant drop in the resistance index in the treatment group. So where the artery was delivering blood to the through the mesenteric artery to the gut, there was a change if the pressure was applied to the gut reflexes, and there was no change when it was applied to other reflexes elsewhere. They were only measuring the mesentery of the gut, so they wouldn't notice if there was a change in the kidney, for example. They weren't looking at that area. And so what they said was that the results indicated an increased perfusion. Perfusion means blood flow into the superior mesenteric artery, and the areas supplied by this blood vessel. So it's a big blood vessel, it goes into the gut, and it was helping the areas where the blood flow was needed around the gut. So at the very least, what this was partially explaining was that there are many instances of therapists like you and I reporting beneficial effects of reflexology with intestinal related problems, and that could be constipation, IBS, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, the other one that begins with D, diverticulitis. And it could be any of those, because increased blood flow brings increased white cells, so increased clear-up rate of any bacterial problems, increased potentially inflammation as well, because don't forget white blood cells do lots of different things, but it could be bringing inflammation, which is part of that clean-up process. It could be taking toxins or waste products, I much prefer the word waste products away, and bringing nutrition and oxygen to the area, because that's what blood flow does. So this study is slightly more recent. This is the cardiac index, and this was carried out in 2012, and we actually helped with this study. This was done up in Stirling, so not Germany. It was actually done here in Scotland, not England, in Scotland. And it was a study where they looked at what was called a crossover trial. So they were bringing clients, well, obviously they were patients because they were in the hospital. They were bringing patients in, and they were using half of their foot on 1 week, sending them away, and then doing half their foot on another week. And they were looking at the different responses they got, and they used something called a task force monitor, which would basically measure loads of cardiac parameters. They had things stuck all over them, measuring changes in a whole load of things. And they did, what they did was they were looking specifically for changes within the heart point, but of course heart point can be all over the place if you look at the various foot maps. So what we did was we suggested they just use the cardiac area versus the heel, so that nothing would overlap on the heel that was potentially in the cardiac area, and nothing was in the cardiac area that would overlap with the heel area. So we had an intervention, top half of foot versus controlled bottom half of the foot in the same person. So they had the first half done 1 week, came back and had the second half done a second week with a gap in the middle. And there were 16 volunteers in this. And what they found was it was a very modest change. These were not unwell people. But they found that there were basically no statistical significant differences amongst most of the parameters, but reflexology did appear to affect the cardiac index to a significant level. The cardiac output was affected in the intervention group when they did the top half of the foot, but not when they did the bottom half of the foot. It wasn't significant overall. There's a whole statistical thing that, quite honestly, I don't really understand, but they did find that when they compared it to baseline, it made a difference. So again, reflexology is changing that index, that resistance thing, and about how moving blood around. So we know that there are some links from organs, from reflexes to organs, but we don't actually know how it goes from foot to the organs in the first instance. So these studies were carried out by the people in Japan, a university in Japan, and they were looking at functional MRI measurements. And this is an MRI machine. Some of you may have already been in one. They're very noisy, they're not particularly pleasant. And they were doing the reflexology treatment while somebody was in an MRI scan. So again, it really wasn't very reflective of a proper reflexology treatment. It wasn't calm, it wasn't beautiful, it wasn't smelling lovely, it was very clinical. Now, what they used was functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, as opposed to standard MRI. MRI is very much used for a snapshot, whereas functional can show changes over time. And the reason that it works is because there's differences in the magnetic effect of oxygen-rich, so that coming straight from the artery, versus oxygen-poor blood where the oxygen has been moved, and that's venous blood. And deoxygenated blood, where the oxygen has been removed through use, is more magnetic than oxygenated blood, which is less magnetic. So as the blood flow changes with the neural activity, so the magnetization of the blood changes, which is how you can see changes in the brain. If there are thoughts, if there are changes, it shows as a change in magnetization. And this is all called hemodynamics. Fabulous name. Dynamic means movement, hemo means blood. It's about movement changes. And it's linked to neural activity. So as the brain is more active, so the blood magnetization changes. As I said, MRI alone gives a static snapshot view of the brain. fMRI provides a functional active view of the brain in real time. So you can see, if you do this, if you press this point, where's the changes in the brain. Just going to have a quick sip of my tea before it goes completely cold. Cheers. So, before I get to this slide, because this slide is complicated, and this slide is basically just showing you what happens in an MRI. So at the top you've got neural activity in the purple, in the middle you've got blood supply in the grey, and then you've got magnetic resonance change in the green. So when there is no stimulation coming into the brain, you've got low neural activity, you've got deoxygenated venous blood being used, and you've got high magnetic resonance imaging. When you get a stimulus, what you get is you get the change. So you get high neural activity, you get deoxygenated blood because the neurons have used the oxygen, and then you get a low magnetization, and when the stimulus goes away, it all changes back. And that's how you can see differences in the brain when you are when the brain is receiving stimuli, and that stimuli can be anything. It can be through your ears. So they've done studies where people have been talking to the people having fMRI, and you can see changes in how their brain is using the information they've got. In this case, the stimulus was coming from the foot. So this was the first study. Note the second author in is Miura, because she appears on the next study as well. And it's a 2008 study. They used 25 healthy volunteers. They randomized them as to whether they got 3 reflexes in different stimulation points, and those 3 stimulation points were shoulder, eye, and intestines. And they were looking specifically in this slice of the brain. Now, this slice of the brain is the somatosensory cortex, the green slice, not the red slice. The red slice is about motor movement. The green slice is about touch. And that's quite important because you get different stimuli into the motor cortex than you do into the touch cortex. And what we've got here is we've got what's called a Penfield's homunculus. And a homunculus shows how much of the brain is given to each varying part of body part. So some body parts will have much less use of the brain. Other body parts need a bigger part of the use of the brain. Lips, for example, are very highly represented, as are hands, because you get a lot more sensory input from them than you do, for example, your neck, for example. So that's what they use. They use Penfield's homunculus. And I want you to remember somatosensory cortex because it's going to come up later. So the sensory stimulation was measured by locating a region of interest. So they were looking for that magnetic change in certain parts of the brain, and they were looking to see where the greatest blood flow was. So that's hemodynamics. So when they stimulated the left-hand side foot, I don't know how much can you see of my body? Oh yeah, you can see a bit of my body. So when they stimulated the left-hand side foot, what they found was they had responsiveness in the left-hand side of the body, in the left-hand side of the brain rather, in the area that said, my body's being touched. It was the tactile area, the somatosensory area. And they found that if it was the eye or the small intestine point, it came up in the left-hand side. If they did the left-hand side foot for the shoulder point, it came up in the right-hand side of the brain. Now, in my mind, that potential is because the shoulder point is a very large point, and it may well be that they were working a different area than perhaps you or I would use, or perhaps they just didn't get it right every time. And that would show that there was a stimulation in the upper limb, whereas the other two, going back, the other two were either in the eye or the trunk. So the relative areas of the brain were not labelled what we would think of them as the reflex points. So the eye was the eye, but the small intestine was the trunk, whereas the shoulder would have been the upper limb, so up here. And I think maybe that was where the problem came with the research. Normally when you've got neurobiology going on, left-hand side stimulation triggers right-hand side of the brain. But in this study, left-hand side stimulation from the foot triggered left-hand side of the brain. And that's kind of exactly what we say in reflexology. We say that left hand sticks with left hand and right hand sticks with right hand. So that's really quite interesting in itself. But as I say, it was only in 2 of the points and not the third. And in the third point, the shoulders, it was only a tendency of activation as opposed to a significant activation, of which the first 2 were. So the first 2 were really clear cut. The first 2 was left-hand side of the foot, left-hand side of the brain, in the right areas, significantly activated. With the shoulder, it was sort of a bit wishy-washy, and it came up in the right-hand side of the brain. So because of the shoulder not being clear, they had to put in the paper that laterality of activation was not conclusive. So we can't absolutely say that there is research to show this, but there is an indicator. And obviously further research might show a difference. The second study, and again, as I showed you the author in the first one, Miura, she appears in this one now. She's now second author, so she's now first author, so she's gone up in the world. They were looking at something slightly different. Now, this is an open access paper, which means should you want to, you can actually go and read this direct. But I would tell you it's quite heavy duty, it's quite full on, but you can go and read it if you want. So this one again was a randomized study, and what they did with these people was they gave them disinformation. It was called pseudo information. Now in Japan, they believe the base of the second toe and the base of the third toe the base of the second toe is eye, and they were telling them that the base of the third toe was shoulder, which of course we know it's not. It's nowhere near the base of the third toe. And then the other group, they told them the other way round. So they told them the base of the third toe was the eye. And what they found was they had 32 healthy volunteers. So not a small group, not an insignificant group, but not massive like you'd expect with drugs trials. And they found that when they stimulated what was the eye point, they found activation in the part of the brain where you would expect to see a reaction by people touching the face. So rather than touching the eye and it being specific to the eye, it was touching the face. And they found that it was same-side activation, and exactly the same as we would say with reflexology, that it was left to left. But that's not expected in neurobiology. As I say, in neurobiology, everything crosses the side of the brain. So it seems that from this piece of research that with the eye point in particular, you're getting a reflex point that can be seen in the brain, and it was on the right side. But what was really, really interesting in this study is that it didn't matter what it heard. So it could have been told it was the eye point, or it could have been told it was the shoulder point, that people were informed what it was. If it was the point that was related to the eye, the brain showed eye. Even if the brain was hearing it was shoulder, the brain still showed eye. And that's really quite significant. It wasn't anything to do with what they were hearing in their ears, it was what they were feeling from the feet. So that's important. That's showing that the reflex area in the foot is doing something that projects to that somatosensory cortex, and it has a lateral pattern. It stays on the left-hand side of the body, and that differs from the neurobiological somatotopical representation of the body. Normally it would be the opposite side. So this is underlying some of those underlying things we say, left stays on left, right stays on right, and that it's to do with the stimulation of the foot as opposed to what they're hearing, is coming out of this piece of research. So it shows, for a start, that we can use fMRI studies to investigate reflexology, which is fantastic news if you've got an fMRI machine stuffed in your back pocket, which of course we don't, and most hospitals don't. fMRI are much more expensive and much more difficult to get hold of than standard MRI studies, and therefore unless it's being done at a university, and they happen to have an fMRI machine, which most universities don't, then this is going to be extremely difficult to repeat in terms of getting everyday research on reflexology done. It also shows that the brain blood flow matched the reflexology points, which is really exciting, and it also showed that one-sidedness as opposed to cross-sided effect. So, and most of all, and I think this is really important, it doesn't matter what the brain hears, it reacts to what it was feeling through the foot. It reacted to what was feeling through the foot. So, how might reflexology work? So the summary of those last studies, which is all we've got on how reflexology might work, there is some sort of connection between the foot reflex and the brain. That is being shown by the fMRI studies. Is that neural? Is that fascial? Is that chemical? We don't know. That hasn't been looked at. We just know that there is a connection between foot and brain. And there's also some connection between foot and organs. Again, is that neural, fascial, chemical? We don't know. But those studies on the mesenteric artery, the arcuate artery in the kidney, and the effect on the cardiac index suggests, it's not proof because it's not big enough research, but it suggests that there is a definite link in that area. But what we don't have is any connection between the foot, the brain, the organ. So we don't have the triumvirate. We don't know where that connection, how that connection comes into play. So that would be great research to do, but we don't have our abilities to do that because we don't have a functional MRI machine in our back pocket. But maybe these connections can be elucidated, can be seen to be a bit more clear from other branches of science. So we have to look slightly sideways at parallel research that's going on. And potentially we need to think about what's going on under the skin, because we all work skin. So we have tactile receptors under the skin. We have different ones in hairy skin than we do in non-hairy skin. This is a bit of a mixture of picture because it's got all of them put together and they don't coexist. So we need to recognise there are certain things in the non-hairy skin compared to the hairy skin. So glabrous or non-hairy skin, fabulous word, don't know where it comes from, but glabrous means palms of hands or soles of feet. And going back to those original definitions I gave you, that was where reflexology was performed. Palms of feet, soles of hands. It's also the genitals, however, glabrous skin. And I am absolutely not suggesting any of you go off and start doing genital reflexology. Please don't. Although I have heard it suggested by one of the Scandinavian countries, so it may be something that comes in the future, but I don't think we'll be supporting it. So glabrous skin in particular has 4 different types of mechanoreceptors. And I think we need to understand the mechanoreceptors a little bit more. And I've actually done a bit of swatting on the way here, so I've got a bit more information for you. So these are receptors. Mechanoreceptors are receptors in the skin and on other organs, and they detect sensations of touch. And they are designed specifically to detect mechanical sensations or differences in pressure. And any mechanoreceptor is, plus a sensory nerve, is then called a sensory unit. So you've got the receptor in the skin, and we're talking about here glabrous skin, and it goes via a sensory nerve upwards. Now, these mechanoreceptors have the ability to respond to sustained stimuli, and that can be fast or slow adapting, so that they can react quickly or they can react slowly. And they also have a receptive field type, which is a type 1 or type 2, and that's basically to do with the size of their reception. Might sound a bit confusing at the moment, but I'm going to show you some pictures which might help. So these are the mechanoreceptors on the feet. I've also included in the next few slides some data about the mechanoreceptors in the hands, because when we're thinking about mechanoreceptors, we are applying pressure to the mechanoreceptors in the feet when we apply foot reflexology. We are applying pressure to the mechanoreceptors in the hands when we are applying hand reflexology to the receiver. They are receiving pressure, but we are also feeling pressure ourselves in our hands. Because when we are feeling for those tiny little bits of grittiness or tightness or looseness, we are using our mechanoreceptors. So we are using that ability to discern differences in texture with our mechanoreceptors, and we are working on their potentially, and I'm not saying this is an absolute truth, but I think it's potentially, we are working on their mechanoreceptors in their feet. Now this pie chart, which you can see there, shows the percentages of the different types of mechanoreceptor in the foot. I'm also going to go through with them in the hands. So the biggest percentage by far is the fast-acting 1 type, less of the fast-acting 2, less of the slow-acting 1, and slightly more of the slow-acting 2, but not much is known about the slow-acting 2. And as you can see from this map, the other thing I would say is there's an awful lot all over the feet. but I'm going to show you something a bit later. So fast adapting one is called nerve process with a Meissner's corpuscle end. And these are about 40% of the innervation of your human hand. So when you are touching, you are using about 40% of what you discern through touch to do with your Meissner's corpuscles. And it requires a very light touch to change that end, to cause a stimulus. And it's very much involved in the adaptation to changes in texture. It lives just under the epidermis. These live, rather, just under the epidermis. And they react with really fast stimuli coming off. And they need very minimal skin depression to use it, which is that light touch thing. Minimal skin depression can fire the Meissner's corpuscles off. And they work to low frequency vibrations. And so they are very good at discerning textured objects, textured surfaces. So for example, my trousers are linen, and I can feel that feels very much different to the ribbed cotton of my top, and very much different again to the vinyl of the arm of the chair. And that is coming from these mechanoreceptors showing me differences by firing different messages up through these 4 different types. Now these have small receptive fields, and they work on and off. They have an on and off response. The next ones are the Pacinian corpuscles, and these are about 10 to 15% of the human hand, which is less than they are on the feet. They require on-off pressure, and I'm doing this to remind you of our caterpillar. On-off, on-off. And these are involved in the perception of high-frequency vibrations. They live under the subcutaneous tissue, so they're lower. The first ones are in the epidermis. These are lower in the skin structure, and they're also based in the intraosseous spaces, which are down quite near the bone, and they're also in the mesenteric area in the gut. And these have a low response threshold, so they react to very fine surface textures, very high vibrations. And they can also cause tickle feelings, these particular receptor types. And they're quite large. Now, if you look at that foot, I think you could absolutely see that quite a lot of what we do will probably be included under this Pacinian corpuscle end nerve. Then we go to the slow adapting ones. So these are slower to react. The Merkel corpuscle is under the skin, so it's actually under the dermal ridges. I want you to think about potentially where you put your pituitary point. Many of us put the pituitary point in the whorl of the thumb or in the whorl of the big toe, dermal ridges. This requires static stimulation, so a push and a hold, and it works with a sensation of very light pressure. These are quite sensitive, and they are involved in the perception of shape and texture. So shapes, edges, ridges, rough textures, and they have small receptive fields. These I'm not so convinced that we do a whole lot of action on when we're doing reflexology. If you look, they're very sort of edge of the foot as opposed to in the middle. And then finally we've got slow adapting twos. Slow adapting twos are not particularly well understood. They're only 20% of the hand, and what they require is a skin stretch. I'm thinking of some of those movements we use that I mentioned earlier. They're not all on-off pressure, some of them are skin stretches. And these are, the hook and back up, for example, is very much a skin stretch. So these are very deep in the skin. They're also on ligaments and tendons. They're very involved in knowing how the body is moving, and they come with, their main thing is internally generated stimuli. So this is not about receiving information from the external point of view, as the other 3 are, but very much from the internal point of view. So they're deep in the skin and they're on ligaments and tendons. And they're not particularly well understood, but they like sustained static holds and skin stretches. So these mechanoreceptors are sending stimuli up to the, and you get increased frequency stimuli that goes up via the sensory neuron, and it goes up to the CNS. And it goes to, yes, that word again, the primary the primary somatosensory cortex, which is exactly where the fMRI studies were showing change. And they also go to secondary corticals as well. And all they are about, or mostly what they're about, is this differentiation of discriminative touch quality. So they're knowing what are you feeling, but they are also very much part of proprioception. And this is all about keeping the individual safe. So what is proprioception? Proprio means internal, ception means knowledge. So you're knowing about what's going on. No, proprio means external, ception means knowledge. So it's the ability to receive information about oneself. It's important to know where your body is within a bigger environment. And it's essential for the motor coordination of the body. If you don't know where your feet are, you're not going to find it easy to walk on a surface, because you don't know where your feet are. So it forms, proprioceptors form, and I put this quote in specifically because it used reflex, and I think this is important. Proprioceptors form reflex circuits with the motor neurons to provide rapid feedback about body and limb position. So it's involved in balance, it's involved in standing upright, it's involved in just simply knowing where your body is at any one time. And it's an interaction with the environment, that touch sensitivity, that discriminative touch, being able to know what's going on around you. Is this cold? Is this hot? Am I going to burn myself? That sort of thing. Talking of hot, I'm just going to have a quick sip of my tea. Whoops. While it still is hot. So proprioception is really important as a human walking around on the ground, and it gets lost when you go into space. So spacemen don't have proprioception. They find it very complicated, and they actually have to put different things in place. So I just want you to recognise the link between what potentially we have going on with the mechanoreceptors and what potentially we have going on with our foot mats, and also to highlight the fact that actually we don't have very much going on in the ends of the toes, and we don't have very much going on in the base of the heel, yet nevertheless there are mechanoreceptors in there, so maybe there needs to be more work going on in those areas. So now we go to non-glabrous skin. So this is hairy skin. This is everywhere else apart from the palms, the soles of the feet and the genitals. And this brings into play a new branch of neuroscience. It's only been going for the last 5-6 years, and it's called affective touch. And these have specific nerves called C-tactile afferents. Afferents send information up to the brain. Efferents send information from the brain to make changes. These are C-tactile afferents, and they are based in the hairy skin. They respond to slow, rhythmic stroking at skin to skin temperature. They've worked it out. They've done all the tests. They know if you go too fast, it's not good. If you're too cold, it's not good. If you're too hot, it's not good. It's skin to skin temperature. And they, what comes back from these nerves is you get processing of body signals, and it goes via what's called the interoceptive pathways. And these have a role in the control of organ functions. A role in the control of organ functions. How an organ changes is to do with these particular nerves. So what's interoception? Interoception, like proprioception, is ception, i.e. the state of feeling, intero as in the internal side of the body. And it encompasses the brain's process of integrating those signals that are given from the feet, from the skin, from whatever, from wherever, all the hairy skin, back into the brain subregions, and yes, the somatosensory cortex of the brain comes up again, along with a few other places too. And this allows for a subtle representation of the physiological state of the body. So it's not, I'm feeling cold, it's a bit more subtle than that. And this is really important for maintaining homeostasis in the body and aiding in self-awareness. So when we are working with those CT afferents, we are working on things like homeostasis and self-awareness. This also provides, this type of touch, this affective touch, also provides comforting interpersonal touch, conveying social support. And I want you to think about 60 years ago, we were all far more touchy-feely than we are these days. And a lot of that comforting interpersonal touch would have happened without thought. You would have had big families living together. You would have got lots of cuddles from your granny and your aunties and your next door neighbours who were pseudo aunties. Everybody would have been cuddling children. They would have got cuddles from their teacher at school. We would have been probably a little bit more open with touching. And even in the workplace now, it's become very much a no-no for very good reasons, but we are reducing our comforting interpersonal touch. And if you go to the apes, chimpanzees in particular do a lot of grooming, and part of that grooming is you are part of our group. I don't groom you because you over there in a different group is not part of my group, but I am going to groom all my people in my group. And that comes again from these CT afferents. And it goes to specific parts of the brain. The social support area is a different part of the brain than the touch area, than the somatosensory cortex. And this work that comes from the effleurage points we do aids body ownership, the psychological self. And it modulates pain and it mediates hedonistic touch. Now, hedonistic touch is a common circuit for all pleasure. Being a bit of a hedonist has got it's got a bit of a negative context in the way it gets used these days. People who use drugs, lots of alcohol, lots of sex, etc., are all they're called hedonists. But actually, hedonic pleasure is something a bit more sensory than that. It's touch, but it's also pleasure, such as going to a beautiful exhibition, or seeing wonderful, or eating wonderful food, or having very high moral discussions. And it's healthy. Normal pleasure is essential for healthy psychology and well-being. So by doing some of that affective touch stuff, we may well be tapping into this hedonic system. And then, we quite often say we help with pain, and we need to look at the pain gate theory for this. This is some research that was done in 1965, so it's quite old. It is being updated, but it's quite old. And the pain gate theory asserts that non-painful input closes the nerve gates to painful input. So the thought is that we have touch coming up on a fast track and pain coming up on a slow track, and the touch then, the nerves for the touch goes in front of the nerves for the pain and blocks the pain signal. And so by non-noxious input, we are able, in theory, to suppress pain. And that's even part of, you bang your elbow, what you do, you rub it straight away. That is all part of that same thing. So my thoughts are, reflexology is not just a specific action. It's not just the direct action of pushing this point here, which does something in the brain, which makes the organ change. It is very much a mixture of the whole. It's not just discriminative touch. It's not just effective touch. It's not just interoception. It's not just pain gate theory. It's not just proprioception. It's quite probably got other layers to it as well. It's quite probably got fascial layers. Fascia was originally deemed to just be a connective tissue under the skin, but actually it's being seen to be much more communicative than that, much more connective than that. So there's quite a possibility that fascia is having a really important input into it. Muscles, some of those mechanoreceptors go deep into the muscles. Muscles inevitably will have some effect on this as well. And it can also be intention. When we apply an intention, how much are we having an effect on the body? And that comes into quantum physics, and believe you me, that is a big whole subject that I certainly am not capable of taking on, but we might be able to get somebody in the future that can. So it's rather more the sum of the whole. It's holistic. It's not just press this button and it does this. It's the whole treatment, it's effleurage, it's the lot. So let's have a look, going back to that original slide, on how does reflexology work? What does it do? It rebalances brackets homeostasis. That comes from the interoception world. It de-stresses, that's interoception and hedonistic touch. It may help with pain, that's the pain gate theory. It may help at an emotional level, that's the hedonistic touch. It feels good, that's the hedonistic touch. It's enjoyable, hedonistic touch again. Enhances body awareness, interoception and proprioception. There's some research that shows that reflexology helps the elderly maintain their balance. Well, it's no great surprise if it is helping with the proprioception. And of course it helps well-being with that hedonistic touch. So when you are doing a treatment, you are not just doing one thing, you are doing all of these things. And if you are doing somebody who's unwell, who has been unwell, who is very old, who is very young, who is going through cancer, for example, and our advice always is to do shorter treatments. You are shorter, lighter treatments, you're probably doing a lot more of that effective touch and a lot less of the mechanoreceptor type stuff, the discriminative touch stuff, but that doesn't mean you're not doing anything, because you are actually stimulating the interoception, the hedonistic touch side of things a little bit more in those people that need that. And when you're looking at people with mental health issues, you certainly should be doing that. So, and then on top of this is the non-specific mechanisms, which we can never take out of this. There is always the relationship that you have as a therapist with your client. The better relationship, probably, quite possibly, the better reaction your client will have. You are an empathic therapist, so how much of that interacts with what you're doing as well? You do active listening. When somebody is going on about how they're feeling, you're actively listening to them. You're not just letting it fly over the top of your head. And of course, we are very supportive in whatever it is we do. And we cannot cancel out, although I know we'd love to, the whole placebo effect issue. Placebo effect is there. And as far as I'm concerned, if somebody starts to feel better, whether it acts by placebo or any of these other mechanisms, I don't particularly mind, because as long as they're feeling better, I feel I've done my job. So those are some references if you would like to go away and look at them. They're not that easy to get hold of, but they are out there. I can always help if you need them, if you really want to read them. And time for questions. So do we have any?
No questions. Everyone's watching, so thank you, but no, we have no questions.
No questions?
They're
Have I
stunned.
baffled you all?
They're
Oh my
stunned.
goodness me. I love to baffle. No, I don't love to baffle people. I hope that you've been able to understand some of it, you've got to grips with some of what I was saying. I think there is, as I say, a whole load more of stuff that we could be looking at, but these are just things that are coming out of science now, and I think we need to be aware of them, and we need to take them in, be aware of them, and continue doing what we're doing.
You said there was a second part to this. Did you at the beginning? What's that?
So the second part of the talk I gave in Canada, the second part was what research has been done. So it was about where we can see an effect of reflexology on conditions or other things, and that's going to be recorded in August. So I will re-record the whole thing and put it out as a video as a whole, as opposed to, because we couldn't fit it in, it was a 2-hour talk in Canada.
This video will be available.
Yes, you'll be able to see this again. You just have to, on the Facebook page where you're watching now, if you go up to the left hand corner, if you're on a non-mobile device, you can see that it says videos. If you're on a mobile device, you have to go to the top of the page and there are 3 little dots and it's under there, and you'll be able to see them all of the ones we've done previously. So it will be there for as long as Facebook allows us to have them there, and who knows with Facebook, because quite honestly they changed their minds at the drop of a hat. But I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and goodbye.